All right, Mary Beth, why don't you kick us off?
I'm happy to do that. Thank you all so much for joining us today. As we were just discussing, the day before we have a vacation day. So we especially appreciate you giving some time to us for this, the second event in the Student Success Series. So I think today's going to be really a great conversation. I want to take a minute to say how much I appreciate the way that we are all working for the same goals in these very difficult times we've been dealing with. And I have had the pleasure of going to a lot of the listening tour meetings that President Beck is having with faculty and with staff across the university. And in every meeting, a faculty member will mention how important they feel that they have been to our students in this difficult time we're going through, providing support and counseling and advice, encouragement. And so many faculty have also then mentioned how they've gotten so much, taken so much value and encouragement to themselves from these conversations. And so that it's been valuable on both sides to come together. And, you know, we were talking about looking forward to the future. And I want to say to everyone again that I'm so looking forward to having our community back. We need our community back. Our students need it, and we need it as well. So I just want to again say how much I appreciate the hard work that we've all been going through during this time. So thank you for that. I want to hit just for a minute on a topic that's very important in the whole student success work. And that is the work we need to do and continue to do to close the equity gaps in the achievements of our students. And so that I thought that Dr. Bocanegra did a very good job. I think it was last spring when she talked about the way we all look at student success a little differently maybe, and we might have different definitions of it, but I think all of us can find common ground to agree that closing those achievement gaps, those equity gaps that we're seeing, is really a critical part of what we do. We know that in the pandemic, this is really especially important because we know the pandemic has disproportionately had negative effects on the racially minoritized groups. And so this makes this conversation today, I think, especially important. So we know that, again, finding common ground to discuss, to center our conversations around student equity has this hard work that we've got to do. And I really feel encouraged that we are making advances. We are moving along towards our goals here. So Dr. Frank Harris's talk today, Advancing Equity in a Climate of Resistance and Challenges, it really is challenging us to put our culture, to align our culture with our core student success values. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our distinguished speaker today and CSU colleague, and then we can carry his words and carry this conversation into the work we're doing in the future. So now I'm going to introduce Dr. Harris. Dr. Frank Harris III is a professor of post-secondary education, and he's co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab at San Diego State University. He's the senior strategist in the Division of Campus Diversity and Student Affairs. So I think Dr. Harris is best known for his expertise in racial inequity and post-secondary education, student equity, student success, institutional transformation. So his work prioritizes the populations that have been historically underrepresented and underserved in education. So Dr. Harris earned a bachelor's degree in communication studies at Loyola Marymount University. And this is in my notes, this is in bold, and a master's degree in speech communication here at CSUN. And then his doctorate in higher education came from the Rossier School of Education at USC. So we're so glad that you're able to join us today. Many of you will probably remember that Dr. Harris presented at our faculty retreat in January, and he had conversations with our students earlier this month, and I've heard those were very impactful. The student conversations were very valuable, so I really appreciate that. So we're honored to welcome him back for today's conversation on how we can advance equity in a climate of resistance, aligning culture and strategy. So help me in welcoming Dr. Harris.
Thank you so much, Provost Walker, for the very warm introduction. I am a proud CSUN alumnus, and it is always wonderful to be able to speak at your alma mater. And I do recall both the faculty retreat and the conversations that I got to have with the students earlier this month, and they were. I'm glad to hear that they were impactful. Those were impactful conversations, particularly for the students, because I very much enjoyed the conversations and learned a lot from them as well. And so, as Dr. Walker shared, the focus of my talk today is around how do we prepare our institution, right? Cal State Northridge, today, of course, to be able to achieve racial equity. And how do we do so? By aligning our institutional culture with many of the strategies that we typically deploy towards this goal. And so, as you all, if you've heard me speak before, I always like to begin every talk I do with the land acknowledgement to recognize that I am joining you from occupied Kumeyaay land in the Southern California, San Diego, more specifically the San Diego County region. And of course, the Kumeyaay land has protected us, healed us, and has nourished us for generations and continues to do so. So in terms of what I hope to achieve today, we'll talk about really three core objectives here. We're going to talk about racism and racial equity, and how do they impact the experiences of our students, notably our disproportionately impacted students. We'll talk about the barriers that all institutions tend to face when it comes to institutionalizing efforts to achieve racial equity. And then most importantly, we'll end the dialogue today with some strategies, some things that we can all do in our respective roles as faculty, staff, executive managers, whatever it is we may be. What are some things that we can do, and some efforts that we can intentionally employ in order to help our institution achieve racial equity? A quick reminder again, for those who've heard me speak, you've seen this before, and for those who haven't, whenever I talk about equity, I really borrow heavily from a longtime mentor, and I guess a colleague, although it's kind of funny calling her a colleague, but Dr. Sella Ben-Simone, Dr. Bacanura knows her well as well. And she essentially talks about equity as having an intentional or a heightened focus on groups that experience disproportionate impact. Of course, when we think about disproportionate impact, our racially minoritized students typically emerges as salient in that conversation, but it's also our students who may be part of the LGBT community, or our adult learners, or single parents who are also attending. And so there are a number of groups that tend to experience disproportionate impact. And then, of course, we never talk about equity without talking about equity mindedness. And equity mindedness is, we could simply think of it as the ways in which we as educators, how we bring life and how we bring action to our equity work. And we do so by really embracing these 5 core principles that you see here, being systemically aware, being racially conscious and affirming, demanding institutional responsibility and accountability for student success, doing the same for ourselves personally, and then caring deeply about students, their lived experiences, and ultimately their success. And when we're talking about racial equity, I like to borrow from the work of Dr. Ibram Kendi, mouthful today, who wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And of course, he simply defines racial equity as when 2 or more groups are on relatively equal footing. I think we could probably all agree that that is a very simple and a very transparent definition that is incredibly difficult to achieve on a consistent basis across the board. And of course, when we think about what does racial equity look like within the context of education, what are the ways in which we measure racial equity? There are many examples and some key indicators that you see here. Some are more easily measured quantitatively, but some that aren't. So when we're talking about sense of belonging and validation, and institutional receptivity and, being exposed to a culturally relevant and culturally affirming curriculum. All those things are really important when it comes to achieving racial equity, but very difficult to measure unless we're intentional in doing so. And so we're going to talk about some ways in which we can be intentional and accounting for all of the measures, not all, but many of these indicators that you see here. And I've been doing this for a long time, and I've been leading conversations about racial equity for quite some time. And so I am not naive to assume or think that everyone who's joined us today has already bought into this concept of racial equity, already understands why it's important and why do every single one of us needs to care about it and prioritize it. And so to those who may be on the fence or those who may be skeptical or doubt that this is important, I do offer what I think are 4 compelling reasons why we all need to care about it. So when we think about minority serving institutions, right? These are our Hispanic serving institutions, our ANAPESEs, right? And our ANAPESEs are simply institutions that have a critical mass of Asian American, Pacific Islander students and Native American students as well. They sort of, the federal government sort of lumps a lot under this larger category. But it's institutions like Cal State Northridge that are providing the overwhelming majority of our historically underrepresented and underserved students an opportunity or a pathway to post-secondary education to the baccalaureate degree. And so we have to get it right at a place, like we have to achieve racial equity and in our MSIs, right? Whether talk about our community colleges or our universities, because this is where our students are. This is where our disproportionately impacted students tend to attend institutions like Cal State Northridge for some very, very good and very important reasons. But also we have to recognize, because we have the privilege, I should say, of educating a student population that tends to be older, that tends to be more racially and ethnically and linguistically and culturally diverse, that tends to have other commitments outside of school. So more likely to be attending part-time than in the past, more likely to have financial dependence. Nearly all of them who are attending online now because of the pandemic. And so all of this is to say that the traditional paradigm of student success, right? The one that many of us had been socialized to embrace as educators in our graduate education, in our training and preparation, that paradigm of student success really is not aligned with the needs and the experiences of today's college students, right? It is a different population that we serve. And so what that means that we really have to reconsider, reevaluate, and in some ways intentionally reject these old notions of what it means to be a serious student, or what it means to be a successful student, or what does it take to be a successful student, right? So there's a lot of embedded assumptions that we have to reconsider when it comes to student success. And equity is, in many ways, provides the guidepost and provides some direction and understanding of where we need to focus and what do we need, how do we need to reconceptualize what student success is and what it means. Give my interpreters an opportunity to transition. Yep, awesome, thank you. And so a third reason, this is one, I don't like to start with this one, but this is one that tends to resonate with a lot of folks. But the country's, for a long time now, for well over a decade, our country's top economists have warned us that we cannot continue to meet our country's social and economic needs without having a more college educated population. We need more people in our country to have a college degree or credential or certificate or something, right? And the benchmark that is often set or that has been widely agreed upon is that we need about 60% of adults, those between the ages of 25 and 34, to have a college degree or credential. That's what we need to maintain our status and to maintain our pace and to meet our country's social and economic needs. Now, before the pandemic, we were on pace to hit a 60% attainment rate in the year 2048. We can probably easily add another decade to that when we think about the pandemic and the long-term effects that it will have, that it already has in a very short amount of time and will likely continue to have. And so what that means is that we cannot afford to have any throwaway groups. Every single person is important in this, in being able to reach this attainment benchmark. And it's important for all of us, regardless of how we identify and regardless of who we value and prioritize. And then lastly, when we think about the long-term consequences of inequity, whether they're talking about race, educational inequity or inequity in any other domain, inequity is directly related to unhealthy communities and a diminished quality of life and strained social systems and little to no advancement in knowledge and innovation, right? This is what happens, and this is what we continue to foster when we don't prioritize equity. And so given all of that, and hoping that at least one of these reasons is compelling to at least everyone who's here, as a starting point, we also have to really think about, well, how do we get inequity? How does inequity happen? It doesn't just happen overnight, right? Some would say it's inequity. Many of the inequities that we see are intentionally designed to so inequity is sort of built into our system and way of knowing and way of being and way of going about things. And so again, borrowing from the work of Dr. Kendi, he just has a wonderful way of sort of taking complex phenomenon and really making them and sort of putting them in a very simple way. But he simply says this: racial inequities are by and large the outcome of racist policies that are justified by racist ideas. So you take a racist policy, you justify it with a racist idea, you get racial inequities. And so let me provide a couple examples of what this might look like. So the attainment gap. So we know in education, we have huge inequities when it comes to attainment, whether we're talking about those who graduate from high school, those who graduate and transition and move on to post-secondary education, those who graduate from post-secondary education, and so forth. We have huge inequities, right? And many of these inequities, for the most part, can be identified on the basis of race, ethnicity, on the basis of socioeconomic status, and many other dimensions of identity. And so when we think about, well, what were the racist policies that led or that are directly connected to the attainment gap? Well, we think about school segregation as one of about 100, right? But that's the one that immediately comes to mind, for me. And I know some folks are saying, well, hey, Frank, newsflash, school segregation is no longer the law of the land. There was this landmark Supreme Court case that happened in 1954, right? It was the Brown versus Board of Education. You may have heard of it. Well, when that case was concluded and decided upon, that was essentially the end of school segregation as a law. And I would say, you're right, appreciate the history lesson, but we still have de facto school segregation, right? So meaning that, yeah, it's no longer, legally sanctioned, but by the ways in which our schools are funded, when we think about how communities are situated and stratified and organized, and how certain people end up living in certain places and so forth, we still in many ways get the same outcomes or the same consequences, and in some cases worse consequences than we had when school segregation was the law. But regardless of if we're talking about legally sanctioned school segregation or school segregation that happens, just by way of other socially socially prescribed ideas, the racist idea that justified is still the same. And that idea being, Black and Indigenous people of color are intellectually inferior to whites. So they do not deserve schools of equal quality and certainly should not be educated in the same spaces as whites, right? There's your racist idea that justifies your racist policies, that gives us racial inequity, and in particular, the attainment gap. And of course, there's many others that we could, sort of go through the same exercise and likely arrive at the same conclusion. And then you see some other inequities that I won't talk about, the wealth gap and the justice gap, which again are also justified by racist policies and racist ideas. And so when we think about education, when we think about our institutions, when we think about racial inequity, a big part of what we have to do, and we're going to talk about this as we get sort of towards the end of this conversation, but part of what we have to do is to figure out what are the institutional policies, whether those are written policies or just, you know, day-to-day practices that are not written, but that are widely known and accepted and, you know, have been negotiated over years. You know, what are those policies and practices that lead to the racial inequities, and how are those policies and practices justified by racist ideas, right? And so this is part of what we're going to talk about as we delve further here. Those of you who had the opportunity to participate in the faculty retreat in January that I, you know, was privileged and honored to speak at, you probably recall me sharing this list of, you know, all the things that I've sort of encountered, not all, but, you know, a dozen or so of the sort of persistent issues and things that I encounter on a regular basis in my work with institutions that I think are barriers to equity. These are the things that show up time and time again that make it difficult, if not impossible, to make any real noticeable or measurable progress towards institutionalizing equity at hundreds of institutions, right? And so I'm not going to talk about all of these, right? You know, and then I have definitions for all of these, or descriptions, I should say. And, you know, I'll make sure that everyone has access to the slide deck, you know, sometime after today. But the one that I want to highlight is actually on the next slide. The one that I want to spend some time talking about is this one. Racially toxic and equity deprived institutional cultures are, in my experience, one of the biggest barriers to achieving racial equity. And so let me spend a few minutes kind of unpacking this and explaining what this means. And in order to do so, I want to share a short narrative. You know, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't call it a narrative. It's not going to be that long. But you know, an issue that I was dealing with a couple of years ago. I had been doing a lot of work with colleges, and I had seen some colleges do some real good, you know, at the time, innovative things to address equity. And at some of those colleges, right, they were seeing great success in terms of closing equity gaps. The conversations they were having were different. The professional development that they were doing was not only different and innovative, but they were getting more people to participate. There was more buy-in, right? So some good things were happening there. But then I would be working with another institution that was doing the same exact things that institution A was doing, but was not experiencing the same progress, not experiencing the same success. And so I thought about that. I reflected on that. I was often frustrated by that. And then I had somewhat of an epiphany. And I'm almost ashamed to call it an epiphany because first and foremost, it's something that I should have recognized a long time ago. And, you know, an epiphany sounds like this sort of grand, you know, idea that no one has ever thought of and no one has ever heard of. And that's certainly not the case in my situation. But here's why I was seeing differences between what was happening at those institutions. All right, business mogul Peter Drucker told us this a long time ago. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. The reason why, and I'm going to say this, the reason why most campuses are not successful in institutionalizing equity is because we focus too much on strategy and we don't do enough to really do the intentional work that is necessary to ready and shape our institutional cultures. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time sort of explaining what this looks like. And if those of you who heard me speak in January, you probably recall me presenting a taxonomy. I called it the taxonomy of equity of faculty educators' perspectives. And we had the choir and the allies and the resistors and the defiant and the oblivious. And so I have another taxonomy to present. This was a little bit different. This has more of an institutional focus. And so I have found that when it comes to culture and strategy, right, that's sort of the interplay and the intersection. These are our two salient concepts that we'll talk about today. And so when we think about institutional culture, culture is often reflected in the institutional elements that we see presented here. And I'm going to say this, and I say this as, again, someone who's worked with many institutions and who's gotten it wrong many of times. By and large, our equity efforts do not address these key factors that have a profound influence on the culture of our institutions, right? They just don't. Instead, what we typically focus on are strategies, right? Like many of the things that you see here. And so I do want to be clear. I'm not saying strategy is not important. I'm not saying strategy is bad. I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on strategy. In fact, we have to, right? I mean, it's an important part of any kind of institutional transformation or institutional change effort. But what I am saying is that we focus more on strategies than we should, particularly at the earlier phases of any intervention or any effort to move a campus towards equity. And so let's go back to culture and let's talk about what this is and what this looks like. I have found in my work that you can have an institutional culture that is equity enriched or equity deprived, right? Now, of course, there's a lot of what happens in between those two things, right? And I'm presenting it in this binary way for the purposes of the discussion and dialogue and sense making, but there's a lot of fluidity here that I'll talk about as we get towards the end of this. But let's say your institutional culture can be equity enriched, or equity deprived, right? And I haven't done any, intentional work with CSUN. So I'm not saying that this is what's happening at CSUN. This is really just a collection of, the experience that I've had. We're working with a lot of institutions over the years. And so that's where all this is coming from. But equity enriched or equity deprived. And so let me give you a snapshot of the difference between equity enriched and equity deprived cultures, right? You see some examples here. On the left are examples of what an equity enriched culture might look like. And on the right is what an equity deprived culture might look like. So for example, when you look at number 3 here, when we see equity as an indication of institutional responsibility, rather than seen exclusively as an indicator of a student's performance, then this might be indicative of an equity enriched culture. Let me give you another example. Look at number 6 here. When we have leadership that is both transparent and unapologetic about the need and intention to prioritize equity, as opposed to being fearful or ashamed about it. And I know some folks are saying, well, like people are having conversations about equity all over the country, right? In the CSU, we have a graduation initiative, GI 2025. And in many ways, GI 2025 is all about equity. Well, here's what we have to understand. This is still for many institutions, this is still a relatively new phenomenon that's happening, right? Maybe within the last 2 to 3 years, right? A decade or so, you didn't have as much openness, and there wasn't as much transparency, and there wasn't as much with regard to valuing equity as we see today. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, let's go back to our taxonomy and talk about strategy. I have found that an institution, when it comes to equity, you could have good strategy or bad strategy. Now, I kind of struggled with this one a little bit because when I was first conceptualizing this, I had no strategy. And then I had to sort of ask myself, well, what's better? Would I rather an institution have bad strategy or no strategy? And just based on the whole concept and the whole principle of do no harm, I think bad strategy is worse than no strategy, right? And so that's sort of what I landed on. But I'm happy to talk more about this if there's other perspectives on this. But anyhow, let's say this all makes sense. What does good strategy look like? And what does bad strategy look like? Well, here's some examples. Again, on the left, we have good strategy. On the bad, we have bad strategy. On the right, we have bad strategy, pardon me. So looking at number 3, historically, institutions really only prioritize full-time tenure track faculty and executives when it came to professional development, right? So a conversation like the one we're having today, my sense is that there's a lot of, there's a broad group of stakeholders, a broad group of educators that are represented here, right? Some full-time faculty, hopefully we have some part-time and adjunct faculty, hopefully we have some folks that are providing direct support to students, such as, working in financial aid or maybe academic advising or so forth. But historically, that wasn't the way things typically worked when it came to institutionalizing equity. To say today we see it, it tends to be a little bit different. Let me give you another example here. And this is one that I think institutions still continue to struggle with today. Providing intentional spaces for folks to engage in difficult but necessary dialogue about race, racism, and racial equity. On many campuses, this conversation is often muted, unwelcomed, or if it is happening, it's completely disconnected from conversations about equity. And so we're going to talk more about that later. But again, that's another example of good strategy and how it contrasts with bad strategy. Now, let's go back to our taxonomy. Let's bring this whole thing back together here, right? We could have an equity-enriched culture with good strategy. And of course, this is the most desirable place to be, right? Every institution wants to be here. But we can also have good strategy, but in an equity-deprived culture. And I want to tell you what happens when this is the case, right? And of course, you could be applying bad strategy in an equity-deprived culture, and no institution wants to be here. And of course, we could be applying the wrong strategies or bad strategies in a culture that just happens to be equity enriched. And I'm going to tell you what happens there. Also, I do want to make this quick caveat here, quick sidebar. I'm talking about this at an institutional level, but these same concepts apply at a division level and even within departments, right? And so we know institutions are in many ways a collection of subcultures or sub-organizations. And so at each level, this taxonomy can still apply. So that's something to be mindful of. But anyhow, going back to the taxonomy here. When we have an equity-enriched culture and we're applying good strategy, we're going to see some real good success when it comes to institutionalizing equity, right? It's going to be at the core of what we do. But what happens when we apply the right strategy in an equity-deprived culture? Everything that happens with regard to equity is going to be externalized. It's going to be on the margins. It would never penetrate the institutional core. It'll always be something that's happening off on the side somewhere. It's not going to be valued. It's not going to be centered. It's not going to be important, right? It's going to be disconnected from conversations about budget and strategic planning and hiring and all these other core processes that really drive an institution. And then what happens when we apply the wrong strategy in an equity-enriched culture? Well, believe it or not, this is not necessarily a totally undesirable place to be. Because my sense is that the culture is the hard part. Well, it's all hard, right? All of this is difficult. But, if we can get the culture right, then the strategies are, fairly easy to incorporate. And so this is not a totally bad place to be. But what happens when we're here is that we're going to have some successes. We're going to have some pockets of success here and there that we can point to, but we're not going to really know why it happened. And we're certainly not going to be able to replicate it in other spaces and in other places where we need it to happen. And then, of course, when we're applying the wrong strategies in the wrong culture, then we're completely inept when it comes to institutionalizing equity. And so some of you may be thinking, hey, I think we're here. I think we're there, right? Some folks may be thinking that. I hope you are. But to further muddy the waters, there's another thing that I found to be true. Some campuses are great when it comes to working and achieving equity for some students and completely inept when it comes to others, right? And so what this means is that we have to be incredibly intentional and paying very close attention to the progress we're making or a lack of progress when it comes to institutionalizing equity. And so there's a lot to be said and there's a lot to be done when it comes to that. And so returning back to the conversation that got us started around how do we achieve racial equity and having some understanding of what tends to happen, what tends to not happen, how it works, how it doesn't, what some of the barriers may be. I want to offer this call to action to every educator that's here. And some of the things I'm going to offer are going to be within, your locus of control, and other things may not be. But I think it's important for us to have, this larger conversation about what are some things that may need to happen for us to really achieve racial equity within our institution. And so I think the first thing that we have to do is commit to being an anti-racist organization. I think for a long time, institutions have been very comfortable simply stating that they're a non-racist, non-discriminatory institution. And I think we've reached a point now where we have to do more than that. We actually have to be intentionally anti-racist. And anti-racism implies that there's a proactive strategy to challenge and combat racism before it happens, right? And so some things that we can do, right? I talked about this earlier, right? When we looked at racist inequity is the result of racist policies that are justified by racist ideas, where we have to think about how do we engage in a comprehensive audit of all of the policies and practices with the goal of identifying those that create and sustain racial inequity, right? That's a big part of what we have to do. Big job, but that's part of what we have to do, right? And also we think about where do we need to make sure we have race-conscious campus leadership when it comes to hiring, when it comes to setting racial equity goals, when it comes to campus climate assessments, when it comes to investigating issues of bias and discrimination, which happens at every institution, when it comes to high impact professional learning for all faculty and staff, right? These are all places that we can really prioritize and get a sense of, how do we create a Cal State Northridge that is unapologetically and transparently anti-racist, right? That's the ultimate goal, right? Tall order, asking a lot, of course, especially with an institution as large as CSUN, but that's the goal, right? That has to be the goal if we're going to achieve racial equity. We also have to do this. We have to acknowledge the history and legacy of racism. And so this may or may not be salient for an institution like a CSUN, right? I think CSUN was founded, pardon me if my math is wrong, as an alum, I should know this, but I want to say late 50s, early 60s. Am I in the ballpark, right? Somewhere around there, right? So not the same as an institution like Harvard or an institution, like Georgetown that was, founded at least 100 years before CSUN, right? Before the civil rights movement, before ethnic studies, right? Before all these social political forces had came about that it really shaped what institutions were doing, what institutions would look like. But I would say every institution should still, at least talk about this, right? Do we have a sense of what our history is? Do we have a sense of who was denied access to our institution, at the time in which it was founded? What was going on within the surrounding community that may have impacted who was granted access and who wasn't, that may have impacted students' experiences, even amongst those who were granted access, right? This is where you may think about, creating a task force to lead this effort and making sure you have faculty, staff, students, and community members to be a part of it. And if you have someone with some expertise in history or archival research, that's equally valuable. And whatever you do, you make sure you share the findings publicly. And so, creating an opportunity for a campus-wide dialogue about our history and about our legacy and how racism may have been a part of that, right? It's an important exercise for a lot of institutions to do. And also making sure that you do some sort of comprehensive audit of campus rituals and symbols and artifacts that are rooted in racism. And, I actually, this took place at CSUN, as I'm aware that, the library, the previous name of the library was named after someone who wasn't supportive and in many ways tried to create a barrier to the institution being able to bring about ethnic studies, right? As I understand it. And so those are very important things to do. And you can't just stop there, right? You have to find tangible ways to reconcile it. And so you may think about creating a scholarship fund, right, for Indigenous students, as an example. All right, or you may name an important campus program after a prominent Black alumnus. Particularly, thinking about who are amongst the first to attend and graduate from the institution, right? These are all things that you can do as an institution to both acknowledge the history and legacy of racism, but also to reconcile it to some degree. We also have to lift minoritized voices. So making sure that we're proactively seeking out the voices of students and employees with regard to their experiences with racism in and outside of the classroom and the workplace. And this is important to do for a couple of reasons. First, being able to tell your story can be both instructive for the institution, but also healing for the individual. And if you go about doing this, you have to take a systematic approach to doing so. So you have to use good research methods. At a university like CSUN, I don't get too concerned about that. I know they're good folks who know how to do this, who know how to design good studies and so forth. Making sure you're having good questions that guide this inquiry is important, and I'll offer a few here as examples. But also making sure that you take an intersectional approach to how you get participants. So not just grabbing your student leaders because they're easy and convenient, right? And not just getting the folks who work in student affairs, right? Because they tend to be the ones who are most willing to come forward and discuss their experiences, but being intentional, right? Making sure you're seeking out your student athletes, right? Or your adult learners, or your student parents, or students with disabilities, or your veterans, right? Really taking a intersectional approach to this inquiry. And more important, believing what people tell you. I've seen not a lot of institutions, but I've seen a handful of institutions that have gone about doing this, and they were either unhappy with the findings, or they were embarrassed or ashamed. And instead of using that as an opportunity to learn and grow as an institution, they buried the findings, which, in my opinion, was disheartening, because when folks come forward and share their story, they're sharing a piece of themselves. And so to not acknowledge that and to not use it in a way to make things better, I think it's a disservice to those who are part of it. But also, again, it's a missed opportunity for the institution to grow and be better. And so those are some things that you might think about doing. Then we also have to, and I always talk about this, making sure that we're looking at our student success data and that we're doing it in a way that's disaggregated by key populations to reveal hidden patterns of inequity. Dr. Bacanora, has been involved in a lot of equity work that's focused on disaggregating student success data. So you have a resident expert here. So, I would say kudos to the university for bringing her on board. But there's a framework called the Equity Scorecard that, again, Estella Ben-Simone, who I referenced earlier, created. And what the Equity Scorecard does is provides a framework for institutions to think about the type of data they should be consulting on a regular basis that should be disaggregated by key indicators of student success. These are just an example of indicators. You can create your own indicators, but really thinking about what are the data we need to be consulting and discussing on a regular basis to really get a sense of where we are and where we need to grow and get better when it comes to racial equity at our institution. We also have to address racism and racial inequity within the context of teaching and learning. And here's a couple of things that I want to say in this regard. Because racism tends to be embedded in institutional cultures in ways that we don't often recognize, it can have a pervasive but also a hidden impact in every system, process, and structure within the institution. So when we think about teaching and learning, the curriculum often emerges as important. And what we see in the curriculum when it comes to Black and Indigenous people of color is that their voices, perspectives, and contributions to academic fields are largely absent. The curriculum doesn't really speak to their lived experiences, and there tends to be no positive examples of their histories and identities and cultures. And so we really have to think about, how do we create and use a curriculum that guides our teaching and learning that really does elevate the status and acknowledges the contributions of Black and Indigenous people of color, right? It's really important to do, recognizing that most of our fields and most of our disciplines were not necessarily designed and created to do this. In fact, many were designed and created to, continue to advance white supremacy, which is something that I think we all should be concerned about as educators, particularly those who are concerned about racial inequity. And then we have to think about persistent and unchecked microaggressions. And so we know the big three that we typically see, and I talk about these in almost every talk that I give. When it comes to Black and Indigenous people of color, there's an ascription of intelligence where we assume that people of color are not smart, not intelligent, not as capable as other students. Pathologizing cultures where we assume that Black and Indigenous people of color come from families and communities that don't value education. And finally, an assumption of criminality when we associate people of color with being thugs, deviants, and criminals, or assuming that they are always looking to cheat or steal or get over or game the system and so forth. And so we have to be, really think about, well, how do these microaggressions impact our teaching and learning with students, right? That's really important to do. And then I skipped this other one here, but when we talk about invisibility and hypersurveillance, I would say that our students of color tend to often feel invisible in our learning spaces. Invisible because they're not represented, their identities are not represented in the curriculum. We've already talked about that. But there's also tends to be very few faculty of color who are teaching these classes. And so invisible in that sense, but at the same time, hyper surveilled, right? Being one of few in certain disciplines. When you come in late, everyone notices. When an exam is being administered in person, you feel like, the professor's really looking at you as the person to make sure you're not cheating, right? And so there's always this, this dualistic experience of being invisible. And I would say having a lived experience that's not necessarily valued and welcomed and prioritized, while also being hyper surveilled in ways that you would rather not be hyper surveilled. And then, of course, we have to think about how does this manifest within our student services? And so we see three persistent patterns here where, first is where our Black and Indigenous students are underserved and not afforded the same attention, effort, and support from student services professionals as other students. The second is being under challenged when they're directed to less challenging programs or coursework or question why they desire to pursue such coursework in the first place. And the third is being unwelcome when they're treated as though they don't belong in colleges, universities, libraries, or other academic spaces, right? And so we have some, again, we have some work to do when it comes to racial equity within our student services as well. And so with that, I want to thank everybody for listening to me for the past 50 minutes. And it's my understanding that we have some time for a little bit of Q&A and dialogue. And so I welcome that. I look forward to that. And I would love to hear any thoughts or reactions to anything that I've shared today thus far. Thank you so much.
Okay. There's a question in the Q&A. What are some new ways CSUN can engage staff who haven't been given a voice to ensure their experiences of racism can be elevated beyond the typical Title IX office to address systemic racism on campus?
Yeah, really good question. Question I hear often. And let me provide some context here. At a lot of the institutions where I get the privilege of working or speaking, many of our staff of color tend to be concentrated in frontline support type of work, right? So they're advisors, maybe they're working the front desk in financial aid or in registration or enrollment, right? But they're really in many ways, in the front lines when it comes to direct support for students. And so they're very knowledgeable, they're very resourceful, and they're usually the first to know if there's something going on, if there's something problematic, if there's something that's impacting communities of color. They're often the first to know, right? But they're not always treated and valued as such by the institution. And so first, I think we have, and it's not just even the folks that are named, right? This is also the case, with our custodial staff, with our facility staff, with our colleagues who work in, maybe they work in, the campus union and food services and things like that. In many ways, these are the folks that are providing support, ongoing support and validation, and working hard to create a sense of belonging for students, even if they don't necessarily recognize that that's what they're doing. That's what they're doing. And so I think, first of all, we have to value and prioritize their voices, and we have to give them spaces and opportunities to share the knowledge that they have. And, some of us who are faculty members or executives, we got to be in better dialogue, with our colleagues, because there's a lot that we can learn from them. And I don't know that we often see them as colleagues who have this type of knowledge and resources. And again, to sort of bring it back to the question, because the question did ask, about staff of color. I think staff of color are typically amongst those, right? Where we have a high concentration of staff of color, it tends to be in those positions that I've referenced a couple of times here. And so I think there's an opportunity there to bring folks together, making sure they're a part. So certain committees, right? There are oftentimes a university or an institution say, we're going to launch this new task force. We're going to launch this new committee that's going to be focused on student success. And they're not, it's folks who are in certain positions or who have a certain status, but these colleagues are often not invited to be, serve in those roles when they have a lot to offer, potentially a lot to offer. And so even just expanding our idea of who has the capacity and who's positioned to really support students, I think we have an opportunity to expand that as well. That could really help move our institutions forward in a real positive way when it comes to racial equity.
Ooh, okay. Those questions are coming in, Frank. They're firing.
Oh, nice.
How do we address faculty and staff who falsely label themselves as allies while at the same time advancing structural racism in their classes and around campus?
Yeah, this is, so when I spoke in January, this is part of the group that I called the oblivious. Mm-hmm. And in particular, we talked about a group who are oblivious because they were non-reflective. Mm-hmm. Non-reflective means you speak all the equity language, you talk the equity talk, but your actions and how you teach and serve and work with students are not aligned with the values you espouse, right? So what I think, and this is going to be really hard for some, but I think we have to have critical but collegial conversations with folks who find themselves in that space, right? And so I think a conversation like, Frank, I value you, I appreciate you as a colleague. I know you care about students, I know you care about the institution. But when we're in this hiring committee and you say that it's okay, it's fine that we don't have, candidates of color because, there aren't enough who are qualified to do this job, that really doesn't help advance our equity efforts as an institution, right? And so helping folks see the disconnect and the discrepancy between what they say and what they do. Because my sense, and I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to make a huge assumption. Most folks don't set out to be hypocrites. I think most folks, they want what they say and what they do to be aligned, right? They want to practice what they preach. And so I must say that a lot of times this disconnect happens because they don't even realize that what they're saying and what they're doing are not aligned. And so if that were me, I would want someone to kindly point that out to me, not to embarrass me, but to do it in a way that helps me recognize and see, okay, I got some growth to do. I got some things I gotta get better. I gotta build my capacity. I got more to learn here. And then the last point I'll make in response to this question is this, really important. We never, I don't think we ever sort of reach the pinnacle, right, when it comes to building our capacity to be equity-minded, equity champions. No matter where we are, we all have more growth and more work to do. There's always more we can learn. We could always get better, right? We always can. And so I think creating a culture where continuous growth and continuous learning is accepted as the norm, and where folks have an opportunity to say, wow, I didn't know that. I need to learn more about that. Thank you for like that. That needs to be something that I think we all should embrace. Now, I want to be careful here. I want to say a couple things. Part of why that's important, the first thing I want to say, part of why that's important is that I find at universities, everyone is very smart and highly credentialed, right? And so it could be uncomfortable and discouraging to admit that you don't know something, right? Most people at the university don't want to be the one that says, hey, I don't know something. So we gotta change that. And we gotta do better in that regard. But we also don't want to allow people to engage in what Sean Harper calls public declarations of incompetence. That's not okay. Let me give you an example of that. So no one would ever publicly declare, I don't know how to create a lesson plan, or I don't know how to balance a budget, right? Or I don't know how to do any other core competency. No one would ever publicly declare that. But people are very comfortable publicly declaring that they're inept or incompetent when it comes to race, right? Well, I grew up in a community, there weren't a lot of people of color where I grew up. So, you can't expect me to know how to work with students of color. Or you can't expect me to know not to say this or to say that, or not to microaggress someone because, I don't have a lot of people of color in my life, right? That's not acceptable. Okay, so I'm not saying that is something that we should allow people to publicly declare their incompetence and to be comfortable doing it when it comes to race. There's a fine line between that and creating a space and context for people to learn and grow. That's all I'm saying. All right, sorry about that. I think probably took longer than I should answer.
No way. Don't apologize. These are great. These are loaded questions. They're going to take us some time to work through. What are some ways to increase diversity in new hires in the context of institutional constraints? So this goes to how do we increase the representation of the faculty in the classroom so that they create space for students, our students, to feel validated and their identities to be affirmed?
Well, first we have to value it and see it as important to begin with, right? It has to become an institutional value and an institutional priority. But here's what we know about hiring, especially when it comes to faculty hiring at a university. It's largely done at the department and governed at the department level, right? So the institution can say, okay, communications department, my old department, right? Speech comm. You can go, you get a tenure track faculty line, go out and hire, you can do it. Well, typically it's the department that's doing the recruiting, that's deciding where to place the ad, that's sending colleagues to conferences to, do the word of mouth recruiting that's happening. And so the institution has a role to play, but departments have a role also, right? And so there has to be some accountability at both the institutional level and also at the departmental level, right? So that's number one.
Okay. All right.
Also,
interpreters coming in.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, we're good. Yeah.
Okay.
Also, we got to really, in some ways, really change our criteria when it comes to what, quote unquote, a good candidate is and looks like. Like we have these indicators of merit that aren't necessarily aligned with our goals to diversify the faculty, right? So a lot of times when it says, hey, we want the candidate who got their PhD at UCLA or USC or Stanford, right? I'm gonna pick on Dr. Becker. Right? Got a Stanford PhD, right? Has $1 million in grant monies and has 20 publications in the top journals. Right? So a lot of times that's kind of how faculty hiring happens, right? Let's go get the quote unquote superstar. But we also, what we got to start doing, and I'm not saying that those aren't important criteria, right? But we also got to say, okay, who has a track record, a proven track record of working successfully with students who look like and who fit the profile of our students at Cal State Northridge, who are excellent and who are wonderful in many ways, right? Anybody have a track record of success in doing that? Or is anyone doing research that actually helps to address issues and problems that impact minoritized communities, right? Or is anyone, we need a candidate who's doing some innovative, teaching and learning stuff, innovative stuff in the classroom that's preparing our students to go and work in, communities that are plagued by social inequities, right? Or that's going to bring a race conscious perspective to accounting or to the law or to nursing, right? And so we got to really think about, if we want diverse candidates, then we can't continue to do the stuff that we've been doing since 1958 that's kind of gotten us where we are. And I know CSUN is probably, a little bit further along than other institutions, say San Diego State, for example, right? When it comes to faculty hiring diversity. But we got to change the indicators the things that we assume to make an excellent candidate. We have to change those things or expand them if we want to get, a different, different pool. And so, and that doesn't mean that a candidate is less qualified or less excellent. Doesn't mean that, right? Just means that that candidate is excellent in some ways that other institutions, in many ways that the academy has ignored and overlooked and not valued for a long time. That's what that means.
That's an important distinction to make, right? Especially when you're talking about qualifications and meritocracy. It's commonly used. So
right. It's the big three, right? Where'd you get your doctorate? How many grants you got? Grant money you got? How many publications? That's kind of usually what it boils down to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Okay, we have more questions than we have time for, clearly, and I love that this is creating a lot of dialogue and discussion. So I'm going to get to what I can, and then I will definitely take all of the Q&A posted here and try to have a follow-up discussion just centered around this talk so that we continue to have these really important conversations. So
I'll be more brief in responding also. I have a tendency to turn every question into, a monologue, a soliloquy, and I'll try not to do that.
It's hard. These are good. I mean, these are really in-depth questions, and this is where we want people to go in terms of reflection. I think this is really important to think about as an institution. So we're here to learn from you, and feel free to use the time you have, and we'll follow up. There's more time. So this question, how can we challenge deficit-minded thinking and statements such as students are passing really hard classes, therefore they must be cheating?
Yeah, I hear this a lot, especially in the remote learning context in which we all find ourselves, right? I think we have to just challenge it when we hear it. A way that I like to challenge things is by asking questions, right? So what makes you think students are cheating, right? Or do you have any, examples, right, of students who are cheating or cutting corners, right? And so sometimes I like to ask questions that gets folks to articulate assumptions that may be embedded that they may not even recognize are assumptions, right? Because implicit bias could be a real powerful thing. And so I think that's sort of where I would start with that one. Question it and call it out when you hear it.
Right. And it needs to be at all levels, not just certain folks or people, student success people in your area will call that out. Everyone needs to call it out when they hear it. So I like that.
Yep.
Oh, this one. This may take us into 5 o'clock. I don't know.
Bracing myself for this.
All right. Considering how the tenure process protects white supremacy, I'll stop there. No, just kidding. What can in our institutions doing to help propel, our faculty of color who continue to experience racism from the protected staff who know they can do and say anything they want without recourse?
Can we hear the second part of the question again?
So what can we, or what are institutions doing to actively protect faculty of color who are experiencing racism from protected staff, faculty, colleagues?
Yeah. So this gets at culture, something we talked about earlier. So we have to create a culture where it is unacceptable to treat people a certain way, to say certain things, to do certain things. And we have to have good measures of accountability when those norms are violated. Now, some of this might mean you got to have some strong and clear HR policy and some clear examples of, what is acceptable. And if you experience this as a faculty of color, what recourse do you have, right? So that's one thing. But we also know this, that faculty culture in many ways operates, how do I say this? Sometimes slightly below, the radar when it comes to, accountability. So folks know what to say or what to do in a way where they won't be detected, right? So somebody may, they may not say something to someone directly, but if they're on the RTP committee, they might do something or say something to derail someone's promotion, right? And so there's a lot that has to happen there. But I think it starts with culture.
Mm-hmm.
I think it comes back to values, and more important. Here's the big deal. Like the most important thing here is we need folks to be able to be willing to say, no, that's not acceptable. We're not going to do that. That's not going to happen on my watch, right? We need, and particularly we need white faculty who are willing to do that and to stand up and be strong allies for faculty of color, particularly those, in departments where maybe there's one or two and there's nobody else. And so, but it all comes back to culture. It really does. That's a big part of it.
Right. And I think you're also getting at the difficulty, right? I mean, this takes time and it's not always easy to measure the rate and pace at which culture is changing.
Yeah.
So that makes it difficult when we talk about changing culture and unpacking racism in our everyday offices. It does make it difficult to wrap your head around what that looks like.
Yeah, and with culture, if you're not intentionally paying attention to it, you won't see it. Right? Culture is invisible, but has a pervasive. It's all you never see it, but it's always there, and it's always having an impact.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So when things feel weird, or when things don't feel quite right, that's when you sit back and say, well, why is this happening? And to what degree is this part of the culture of the institution or department or office or whatever it may be, is what I often do.
Yeah. I think the other thing that comes up is the ally space and making sure that we're very clear of what an ally is and what an ally isn't.
Right.
I've been in ally spaces where folks think they're being an ally, but they haven't consulted with the groups that they're representing. So they're going in, I'm an ally, and not being clear in terms of their intentions and what groups need them to be doing in a certain space. So I think it's really important. You might end up in the oblivious category if you're not checking in with your folks to make sure that this is in alignment with what we need you as an ally to do. So really important stuff.
Another thing about allies really quickly is we have to get more. So I would say, don't call yourself an ally. Just do the actions that an ally does, right? That's more important than, I don't know. I shouldn't say that, because I think it's important, for example, for people who are part of a community to know that there are allies who are, right, open and apologetic about being allies. So I don't want to dismiss that. That is incredibly important. But I think for the individual who wants to be an ally, focus on the actions of being an ally more so than, labeling yourself an ally, if that makes sense.
Right.
I want to be careful about that.
Or say, I would like to be an ally.
Right.
Tell me what that looks like for this group, right? And make sure you're checking in. Yeah. If you label yourself an ally, you may be in the wrong category of folks.
Right. But sometimes we get caught up in the label.
Yeah.
We get caught up in how are others identifying us. And sometimes that becomes more important than the actual work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think we gotta be careful.
Yeah. Okay. I think the next two have to do with, you mentioned the need for transparency. Are there best practices or tools for measuring the distribution of resources in an equity-focused manner?
Yeah, probably. I'm sure there are. I'm sure some brilliant person has created some metric or something. I don't know any that immediately comes to mind. Sometimes I tend to think about these things in a more conceptual way, and not as much in as pragmatic of a way as I should. So that's something I'm gonna think about. But yeah, I'm sure there is. I'm sure there's some kind of way.
Yeah, we're always looking for ways to do that. I think really putting into practice and conceptualizing the self-reflection piece you were talking about will help to uncover what things are being overlooked, especially when it comes to racial equity, and making sure that we're looking at data, but asking our questions about what is the experience like? How do we match the experience with these data points?
And it's why, I always get worried when I go to visit an institution and they haven't really done any intentional data collection and or data sense making. That's a real key part of this.
Yeah.
You can't do equity. You can't do any kind of equity without it being informed by data. I'm not talking about the data drives everything. I mean, but data has to inform your perspective of what's needed, who's not being served, what are you missing? And it's not even just the quantitative success measures. The qualitative data is also important here as well. And so I think that has to always be at the core of our sense making and ultimately our decision making when it comes to achieving racial equity.
Right. And I think it's those experiences that really move people to action.
Right.
Whereas, having Frank Harris or myself come in and talk to you about your data points is one thing, but talking to students about what it's like, what is their experience, what are they feeling in your classroom, it's so hard to argue against that because it's their perspective and this is what I'm feeling. So really important stuff. Okay, last question and then we'll wrap up because I know it's been a long hour and a half almost.
It's gone so fast. Always does.
How can a place like CSUN kind of accurately measure and assess the progress of institutional equity taxonomy in some of the taxonomies that you're presenting? How can we really kind of act on that and kind of try to categorize some of the things that we're doing? Because like many institutions, we want action. And so we jump into things with really good intentions. And so how do we use your taxonomy to kind of assess where we are?
Well, the taxonomy, like a lot of the things that I create, it's just to guide our thinking and to guide our attention. And so I never say you need to follow it exactly the way it's laid out. And as I mentioned, the fact of the matter is no institution is always equity deprived. No institution is always equity enriched. There's a lot of variation, even amongst those 4 categories that I presented. So that's the first thing. But here's what's important. You got to set some goals, right? Goal setting is important. And not just setting the goals, you got to monitor and you got to figure out what are the data points that we're going to need to let us know what progress that we're making. And I'll say this, and Melanie, you know this, a lot of institutions make the mistake of trying to do too much all at once. And so I think it's better to have fewer goals, but be very intentional and go very deep in pursuing those goals than it is to have, more goals that you're kind of loosely measuring and kind of loosely tracking. And so I think that's important. The other piece, it's a lot harder to do, but I think really makes a difference, is when you have good strategies for accountability. Let me give you an example of that. If I'm a dean, and if I know that, part of how my performance is measured as a dean, it relates to closing racial equity gaps within my college or my area, then I'm going to be much more intentionally focused on that. And so I think we have to figure out, how do we build these measures of accountability into the ways in which we assess the performance of everybody, faculty included, right? It has to be a part of that as well. And so it may look different for different people. It may look different for different positions, but I think we have to somehow make it a priority and make everyone feel some sense of I don't want to say a sense of responsibility, that's going to help contribute, right, to this important institutional goal. That's harder to do, especially at a public institution. There are collective bargaining implications. There's all kind of stuff that makes that hard. The lawyers get involved. And so I usually don't talk as much about that because I don't want it to, make an institution say, forget it. But I think these other things are, having some goals that can be agreed upon, having good bodies, task force, whatever it may be, that's kind of responsible for moving it and making it happen. I think that's a good place to start. How about that?
Yeah, I think accountability is key, and making it part of your everyday. I know every time I see you present, I always try to take something new away from what you're sharing. And I think for me, that's one of those things is, how do I embed anti-racist practice in my everyday practice, in the people that I work with, in the students that I support, and how can I continue to make space for those voices and be prepared to hear feedback that may not always, I'm not going to get it right, because there's no perfect way of doing this work. It's all very messy. And so how do we give people space to try and not create a culture that's toxic for even trying? It's going to be hard. I'm always thinking about, how do I take more?
And I say, the same thing, right? So we talked about a lot of ideas here today. And so I think if there's just one thing that resonates with you, focus on that one thing, right? The thing you say, okay, I think I can do that. I think that's something I can focus on. That is what I would suggest. But anyhow, Dr. B, and everyone, all the colleagues who are here, and Dr. Walker, thank you all for having me. I never take these opportunities to lead these important conversations for granted. I really don't. I appreciate you. And I hope this isn't the last time we get together. Maybe it'll happen in person sooner than later.
Let's hope.
Of course, right?
Yeah, let's leave this on a hopeful note, and let's hope that can happen. We would love to bring you back.
Yes, I would always love to come back. And big shouts to Amber and Kevin, our interpreters, who do some hard work as well to make sure that this conversation can be accessible, because you cannot have a conversation about equity and not have it be accessible to everybody. That wouldn't be a good thing. So thank you both.
Thank you. All right. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to put Cindy, can you put the survey in the chat, please? Because I can't find the link. But we have a survey for all of you who are still here with us. We're going to put it in the chat. We know if we send it after the fact, we'll probably not get any feedback from you. We're realistic with what we got going on here. So the link is now posted in the chat. If you can take a few minutes to give us some feedback, some next steps, suggestions. We always love to hear what you have to offer, and we try to act on everything that you send us. So I just want to say thank you again to Dr. Harris for joining us this afternoon, right before our day off tomorrow. So as you're enjoying your day off, you can think about, what are ways that we can really embed these practices into our everyday and change our culture and really start aligning our goals with what we want to see in our students. And so I want to just thank everyone for coming today, and I will make myself available as always if you all have questions and follow up, and we'll definitely get to the other questions that came up and make sure that we create some space for those as well. So thank you, everyone.
Oh my God, before we sign off, Patrick Bailey and Deborah Hammond are here.
Yes.
I've known and loved forever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wow, that's exciting. Yeah, it's just, just glad that they were here. Just two colleagues who I've known and loved for a long time, and who really embody a lot of what we talked about today. So Deborah and Patrick, thank you both. Thank you both for being here.
Lots of love to you guys.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a great Tuesday evening. Thanks for spending some time with us.